Catherine Palmer, who's not so well today, unfortunately, and Suzanne Schrijnder, and they're going to be talking about sport, leisure, and the new normal. Suzanne is in Alabama, so it's 7:30 Wednesday night her time, and she will be starting the webinar in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to pay our respects to the traditional owner. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So thank you, Suzanne and Adele and Catherine, for agreeing to present quite a timely paper. As in Australia, we're heading into the sporting festival season over the Christmas summer break, and sport is certainly part of not just Australian culture but worldwide culture, and it's helped, I guess, many people get through COVID-19. So thank you, Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, for the intro, and thank you all for attending. Yeah, together with Adele and Catherine, we are the TASA Sport and Leisure Team Group. And yeah, we prepared this webinar presentation for you where we're discussing some sociological insights for developing an agenda for change. Here's a short overview. Where first Adele is going to discuss a return to sports after the lockdown, recovering sport and fitness cultures in a post-COVID-19 world. And then I will be discussing the other current crisis in the light of climate change and the adaptation of sport.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to another Zoom presentation. I know there's been so many lately, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come along. My name is Adele Pavlidis, and I'm a DECRA Fellow at Griffith University at the moment. And I would first like to acknowledge the land that I'm working from, which is that of the Yugambeh people, and it's a beautiful sunny day here on the Gold Coast. I also really wanted to acknowledge those whose experience of lockdown was difficult, especially everyone in Melbourne. You know, whether you were juggling children with work or socially isolated or had family who were isolated or with health risks, so many different ways that people were affected. And it has been an extraordinarily tough year, particularly for higher education, as somehow it was a time for a range of attacks, as well as losing lots of students. So I just wanted to start with that because, I mean, we've been lucky here in Queensland in that we have returned to sport. So there's some particular insights there to share. The presentation that I am giving today is a summary of a recent project I've been working on with Professor Simone Fulliger at Griffith, together with a number of others, so who've contributed intellectually and also practically as research assistants. So the research assistants on this project are Dr. Wendy O'Brien, who's a long-time collaborator, and Erin Nichols, who's a current PhD candidate here at Griffith with Simone and I, and then Professors Deborah Lupton and Holly Thorpe, and also Dr. Kirsty Forstyke at La Trobe have been part of this. So we were grateful to receive some seed funding from the Griffith Arts Education and Law Group to develop this project. Next slide. So in the midst of a global pandemic, as feminist sociologists working at the intersections of sport policy and management, social change and health sociology, we came together as a team to think about the complex entanglements of health, social and cultural aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to sport and physical activity. We were not, even though there has been a range of impacts on elite level sport, our aims were to focus on community level sport. So just that proviso. There were clear emotional and economic issues at play within sport that could not be easily separated. And we were interested to investigate this further. Our initial project was focused on 2 case studies, so hockey as a sport, as a singular case study, and urban gyms. But the focus has ended up being on hockey at the moment, and we've completed 12 interviews with stakeholders, including from the Queensland sport policy sector, so Queensland government, NSO, SSO, and a range of club board volunteers, various kind of policy people. We're also developing a creative time capsule method, which we piloted amongst ourselves with a group of, including some other academic women. And on Monday, we're actually conducting a session with teenage girls involved in club sport. So this time capsule method is about enabling people to reflect on the COVID experience of shutdown and the limited movement that happened, and to choose what they would like to pass on to the next generation. So we ask questions like, what was important? What do you want remembered? What would you include in this time capsule? What objects, as well as what messages? And also what was novel about the experience. So yeah, we're hoping to develop that further as well. So next slide. In terms of gender equity, we've been gathering a range of documentation of the unequal effects of COVID related to gender and race. We found that women were more likely to have lost their jobs. You may have, there's been so much media about this, but women were more likely to have taken on more hours of childcare and domestic work at home. There has been an increase in domestic violence during home confinement, and during this year, it's significantly increased reporting of domestic violence. And there's also a range of research that documents the negative relation between quarantine, social isolation, and well-being, which we were interested to investigate in terms of people's disconnection from sport and physical activity. Next slide. Our preliminary findings are grouped around these three key headings, and we'll just go straight into the first one. Thank you, Suzanne. So the major challenges. The people we interviewed, primarily over Zoom, were exhausted and anxious and grateful to still have jobs, working hard to adjust and respond to this unprecedented health crisis. They were also seemingly happy to have the opportunity to stop and reflect with us. For some, it was the first opportunity they'd had to really stop and think about these things. They were buoyed by the prominence of sport in the shutdown. So with exercise being one of the 4 essential reasons to leave the house, that really kind of, made people feel proud of the industry that they were working in. They also, the attention given to sport in plans to return. So all the return to sport plans, and, sport was really at the forefront of discussions. I remember the day before the main lockdown, it was the Melbourne Grand Prix, and people were lining up ready to go, and when it was all shut down. So it's these major sporting events that, they are vectors of the virus, where people come together and bodies touch. So that was, that it was at the forefront was something that all the interviewees talked about. There was, of course, the primary health risk that needed to be managed first, but there remained much uncertainty and complex challenges in thinking about what a safe return might look like. For some of the hockey clubs, this was too much and the season was ceased. So they just felt that they couldn't meet all of the different requirements. Other clubs ended up with a reduced season, or like a social, very short season. And other clubs who were perhaps better resourced in terms of volunteers ended up going back with a full season, but a range of rules in place. So things like, you can't take your bags in, no touching, no mingling, which was an interesting requirement. So no mingling before or after the games, which in a team environment, I think is quite difficult. And also, it also doesn't acknowledge like one of the main reasons that people play sport is it's not just about getting, 75 minutes of vigorous level activity, but it's about that social aspect. So that was interesting. There were increased digital engagement expectations in many of the clubs for the volunteers. And for some, this was their first time of needing to use, Zoom and all these different platforms, as all of us have had to adjust. But some volunteers simply refused to take up these technologies and so relinquish their roles. You can see on the slide some of the other major challenges included the sheer complexity and unprecedented nature of the pandemic. This was not something that anyone had planned for. There was no research to support decision-making. Decisions were being made above them, and instructions were complex and at times confusing. And implementing everything was costly, just buying more sanitizer, the time taken to put up signs, all the extra time and effort was resource intensive. JobKeeper was important, but for subcontractors who were ineligible, this meant a loss of income. Next slide. So thinking about innovations and changes, one participant told us before COVID, there were a lot of conflicting agendas and separation. But once COVID hit, it was really like we're all in it together. So many of you probably heard this, we're all in it together kind of little, saying. But for the sports sector here in Queensland, that was a real thing because, all the little disagreements and different things had to be put aside as they worked together as a sports sector against this, shared enemy of the virus. It was something they could all work together on. For hockey in Queensland, they returned first to non-contact training, and then the next step was contact training and then competition. Already in the Queensland context, once sport resumed, there was a 75 to 80% return to play, which, there is a concern for those who have not returned, but I think that's quite a high number considering how much of a crisis that we were in. For those that we interviewed, they were focused on those who were returning to play. So it was very operational, not so much those who chose not to return. I think it was a case of people just doing their best. There was an enormous increase in hits on the outdoor recreation websites so we sought to understand the broader sport landscape in Queensland at the time. And it was interesting that outdoor recreation, was really getting a lot of attention. And this was likely people looking for safe activities during and straight after the lockdown period. Next slide. Thanks. Ausplay recently released their findings related to COVID-19. And in their reporting, the main concern is children's physical inactivity during the COVID-19 lockdown. And I was in lockdown for a shorter time than Melbourne with an 8-year-old, and they're definitely not getting the same amount of activity running around and everything. And hopefully, there will be some attention to that now that things are opening up, but I'm sure that it will take some time and concerted effort. But in terms of findings related to adults, which is our focus, I wanted to share this little visual that they released, which is about change in motivations for sport. And of course, Ausplay includes a non-competitive walking, running, and cycling. So there were significant increases in motivations related to the mental health / therapeutic benefits of sport, which also then points to the ABS data that highlighted higher rates of anxiety, loneliness, and social isolation during COVID. In some ways, COVID has more than ever shed a light on the broader social benefits of sport. Although we have seen some shift in sport policy over the years to emphasize the social and mental health benefits, I think that often the sport providers on the ground are really in this kind of operational mindset, and there isn't a lot of mental health literacy or even, knowledge about racism or sexism that comes into it. So emphasizing, a lot of the clubs emphasize, the competitive aspects, organizing the competition over inclusion and connection. And I think that COVID may be an opportunity to bring this to the fore more. And it prompts a question of how can sport providers, including community sport, become more aware of their important role in social life, including shaping gender norms. Next slide. So because COVID-19 was the shared enemy, so to speak, issues like sexism and racism in sport seem to become less important than sport itself, which is problematic considering that there are such huge gender inequalities, particularly with COVID, and also the increased racism that happened during COVID. We had the Black Lives Matter, but all the racism towards people of Asian appearance in Australia, including overseas. So there's this tension between there's been increased issues around sexism and racism, and yet because people are under so much pressure to simply kind of deliver and just do the basic things, these issues are being sidelined. In our interviews, we asked questions about gender equality and any plans for the equitable return to sport. And in most cases, they had not reflected on these questions at all. Yet when exploring them, they found that there were some issues for women. For example, when they looked at, who did come back, there were some women's teams that didn't come back. And that could be around job losses, casualized workforce, and things like that. There was an acknowledgement of the mental health benefits, but not a gendered perception of this. Next slide. And this is my final slide. So now that Australia is relatively safe and most sports are looking to return to pre-COVID conditions, albeit with much higher hygiene values and requirements and some changed regulations, what we've seen in Queensland is a full return to sport for some clubs. And so some of the things that, to share with people in other states is that we saw an eventual loosening of restrictions and COVID regulations over time. So at the beginning of the return to the hockey season, people were quite strict. I mean, there was some people who were never following the requirements, but most people were applying hand sanitizer on arrival, keeping a social distance. So it was like, keep 2 sticks apart or something like that, and not touching any of the equipment, the balls and things like that. And in between games, they had to be sanitized, the dugouts were sanitized, but most of that has fallen by the wayside. There are still the QR code out the front. So at the beginning, everybody must do the QR codes, but now I think more and more people are choosing not to. It's not policed in any way. There's definitely a feeling of normality and safety. So all hockey season, at the end of the game, to say congratulations to the opposing teams, people would like just hit sticks. And so, you used to shake hands and now they would hit sticks. And just in the past couple of weeks, there's a summer season on and people are shaking hands again, which is it feels very strange. I'm sure some of you have been, do we still hug? What is the, etiquette around these things? So things are really returning to normal. There has been reduced funding for sport and recreation departments. So that's been a major problem. They've put a stop to all the longer term equity and inclusion plans, which is going to have some real long-term effects. And there's a burnout of volunteers and staff. Everybody is exhausted. So the issue with all of this is that the disconnection and isolation experienced by some may be minimized, and some people may lose the connection and sense of community, and hence the mental health benefits of sport. Sport has been heralded as part of the key to our recovery, yet there are no resources to do this in a way that supports an equitable recovery. And I just wanted to end with that. I really think that this is an opportunity to do the things that, we've always had social isolation, problems with disengagement, disconnection, and now maybe this is a time to explore better how sport can work upstream, I guess, not at the pointy end of mental illness, but upstream in creating a more equitable and connected world. Thank you.
Thanks, Adele. Now, I will be discussing the other current crisis. Adele just talked about the COVID-19 crisis, and I will be talking about the climate change crisis. The COVID-19 one has been and is handled quite differently from the climate change crisis. But experts continue to warn us about the catastrophic impacts of climate change on the Earth and its societies, and how immediate action is actually required. And since we are discussing crises and a new normal, we found it appropriate to discuss the climate crisis in relation to sport. Because as the cartoon on the right pictures nicely, this is just a primarily round. Earth is fighting COVID crisis, but climate change is around the corner, and depicted as a much larger and more muscular challenge to handle. And then we see here on the left, the Guardian article, some of the COVID recovery plans would actually contribute to furthering the climate crisis and even become more challenging to fight this crisis. So in relation to sport and climate change, we can see how there's a bidirectional relation between the environment and sport, because sport influences the environment and the environment influences sport. So if we look from a bit of a sociological perspective, how are these relations between the environment and sport shaped? So how does one affect the other? And also, who in sport is affected more than others by climate change? And recently, starting at the late 90s and beginning of 2000s, more sport research scholars, mostly in sport management, have been exploring that relationship between the natural environment and sport. Research emerged that looks into impacts of climate change on the sports industry and the adaptations of behaviors by fans, athletes, and organizations. And the topic of climate change is so much related to sport because sport really relies on natural resources. And in case of the crisis, sport is also found to be able to inspire pro-environmental behavior. Now, the climate crisis affects all types of sports. It's not just the elite events or organized sports that we mostly read about in the media. And so this is a sort of a capturing of all types of sport and leisure. And if you look at winter and nature sports, those are very much affected by the rising temperatures because they produce unsafe snow conditions and unstable ice surfaces, which impact snowboarding and hockey, ice hockey in this case. There is an increase in bushfires, wildfires, the hurricanes, the avalanches, and their increasing numbers and severity is jeopardizing the space for sports and physical activity and exercise. Also, thinking about these about elite events, sporting events such as the Olympic and Paralympics, research shows how former host cities will not be suitable in the future to host these events because of rising sea levels, because of their increased temperatures. So either this means that new stadiums and locations are going to be built, which is not good for environment, or perhaps are these events going extinct? As mentioned, there's this bidirectional relation between sport and environment, because in the second part on this slide, sport also impacts the environment, and often in negative ways. Recent research shows how, for example, nature sports, which seem to also be most affected by climate change, have produce the largest carbon footprint compared to team and racket sport participants, for example. And if you look at the sport industry as a whole, there's massive contribution to the crisis of climate change with the emissions connected to traveling and operating large stadiums. And these emissions are equivalent to countries such as Spain or Poland. Now, if we look closer to home to Australia, the Australian Open is a prime example of a sporting event being affected by climate change. Hot temperatures, smoke from bushfires, fainting athletes, melting shoes have resulted in an extreme heat policy and even a push for a change of dates. Except these kind of measures are not going to help against climate change. And so, sociologically speaking, if we look at who's in power and who's being exploited, government and industry continuing to invest in fossil fuels is not going to help the tennis players. Tennis players are not unionized, although there are some male tennis players trying to organize themselves. So how do the athletes stand up for themselves and create a change towards this climate crisis? Now, there are quite some organizations, as you can see here on the board, who are organizing themselves, and they're campaigning for a better environment and less pollution. And for example, the athletes have been organizing themselves within something that's called eco-athletes. However, their agency is also limited and obstructed. For example, here the IOC rules that there cannot be athlete activism within the Olympics and the Paralympics, because sport and politics don't mix, and that is actually a violation of human rights. So this agency, it's an interesting question. And within these organizations and their narratives, there's a lot of parallels between activism against sexism and racism. And I've been teaching my students about Catherine Switzer and how change can occur, because her participation as the first woman ever participating in the Boston Marathon alone did not create change. But her relentless campaigning and with help of many others, they were able to change structure and with that create change. Hopefully these organizations that are organizing their collective agency are able to affect change, although time is running short for this crisis. To discuss this topic was also inspired by a NAS session, NASSS, where Jessica Murphy and Brian McCullough were discussing environmental injustice in sport, and they introduced us to their group, the Sport Ecology Group, which I think is a good example of some academic agency. And there's also some hashtags, No Planet, No Play, to get more attention to this crisis. Now, I want to add as well how climate change is a feminist issue. Women, just like COVID-19, are the most affected by climate change. And as well, where we see this quote from Mary Robinson, who used to be the Prime Minister of Ireland, but is now involved with the Mothers of Invention group campaigning for against climate change, where she says capitalist patriarchy caused this, meaning climate change, the climate change crisis, and it's not going to solve it. So we need feminism. And if you look at sport remains a male domain. So we definitely would argue that climate change is a feminist issue. And an example is the Tour de France, which is known to be one of the most polluting sporting events in the world, which is also a very masculine sport, very macho and polluting. But this question is also very complex. If I look at my own research on professional women cyclists, they lack the grand tours, such as the Tour de France, that carry the prestige and the value that means so much in the sport. But if you think about the carbon footprint and the pollution that this event causes, then there's these two questions like climate change, gender parity. This makes it just really complex issue to discuss. So from the COVID-19 crisis, we know how fragile our institutions are and how limited access to open space reminds us of the inequality to access to sport facilities and activities. And it also, we also know better now how much we need to move and play, how much we need that. And if you think about that hashtag earlier, when there's no planet, we cannot play. So the climate emergency needs action. And from a sociological point of view as well, it's a feminist issue, and it's also a issue where we see how it places disproportionate burden on people with low incomes in the global South and Black and minority ethnic communities in the global North. So these issues needs to be put on the agenda, but whose agenda? I think everyone's agenda, especially sports, the government, because if you think of public health, government uses sport and exercise, physical activity to promote public health, but the climate change crisis impacts that. And if we look at the research agenda, McCullough, Orr, and Kellison are pushing for this formalization of the subdiscipline of sport ecology, where there's an interdisciplinary collaboration to create a better, to close that gap between the practitioners and the academics on this issue. So that was our presentation. Yeah, Adele discussed her work on mostly hockey and post COVID-19, and how in the end there's actually a lot of return to normalcy, shaking hands instead of sticks. And I discussed the other current crisis of climate change and the adaptation of sport. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Adele before. And we can now open up for questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise their hand or start talking, or you can message me and we can convey that message. Alan Scott.
While Alan is unmuting, I just really wanted to say, I think that there's some really important lessons in thinking about how quickly we've returned to sport in Queensland, for example. And so we've just moved forward, adapting to some of these changes without doing much reflection on who's missing out and the sustainability of changes, and then thinking about the climate change crisis, how, you know, it's so easy to ignore because it's seemingly not immediate and urgent. Yeah, I'm just concerned that the fear and anxiety, you know, we've had this opportunity to really say, oh my God, look at what a crisis can do. And, you know, we've been locked down, we've been shut down, and yet that it's passed quickly, and we're kind of going back quite quickly in a way. You know, I hope that we can still really take seriously that time. I do think that in many ways we've shared a collective trauma. Like, I don't know about anyone else, but looking at the news every day and seeing refrigerated morgues, or, you know, I mean, I have like loved ones with mental health challenges who really suffered in isolation. And I mean, it's been hard for a lot of people, but for some people maybe who it wasn't as hard for, you know, I just don't want us to have that bounce back neoliberal kind of attitude, you know, just bounce back, but we can't continue to bounce back forever. The planet will not allow it. So I just thought that it's actually quite good to look at, oh, look, we've returned so quickly after this major crisis, yet we have this other crisis that we need to take seriously.
Thank you, Adele. And Alan, are you able to?
Yeah, I think I can be heard now.
Yes.
I've enjoyed this session this morning. One of the things that I think is with, not so much with people here, but in people in general, is that we're going back to what was. And we're not going to go back to what was. But also that what was is much more complicated than a simple, oh, we can now go to 9 to 5 for work, or our shift work or whatever. There were hundreds of different normal work systems in play. I worked one time for the Thames Authority in London. Now, in those days, the Thames was a major port. It was some 100 miles long, and it had to be patrolled 24 hours a day. And if you ask people about being employed at the Thames Authority, they would be talking about people sitting at desks and filling in forms and that sort of thing. Whereas there was about 30 people who patrolled the Thames on a roster that had to be 24 hours a day, and this was divided over 2 months, so that you worked a day here and a night there, and if you did a Sunday, you had 2 days off, and it was hugely complicated, normal, which people wouldn't have recognized. But now it's disappeared altogether because they built a gate across the Thames and it's no longer the major port. So what was once the norm is no longer. And this is happening all the time. And people have to adapt to it. Now, what was the other thing I was going to say? It's gone.
Okay, thanks. Oh, sorry. So go, Suzanne.
Perhaps people had to adapt so quickly because the lockdowns were so, like, they were coming, but they were also quite sudden. Like Adele was saying, people were standing in line for the what was it, Formula One?
Yeah.
And the next day, the Grand Prix, yeah. And the next day they were in lockdown. And perhaps it was so sudden and so intense that normal was still so close on their radar. That's all they wanted to go back to. And that's now kind of what we're seeing in Queensland, listening to Adele, like those normalcies of behavior, that those taken for granted gestures such as handshakes are slipping right back into normalcy, into daily life.
The thing you've reminded me of what I was thinking of, that in going back now, what you've been talking about is the chance to change what was, so that you're arguing not to go back to the normal as it was, but to a new normal, which is better for this reason or that reason or whatever. And this probably happens all the time anyway, but it's because it's happening to more people in one go, it becomes a sort of big issue.
Ramon, are you speaking?
No, sorry, I'm having serious technological issues all day. So I'm
Okay.
here. I think that's what matters. So I'll just listen.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Adele, did you want to say anything?
I mean, I was hearing Ellen talk, and I mean, I've been, as we all have, it's been such a time of deep reflection, you know, like what is the meaning of life has come up for me many times, you know, and that, yes, we do continue to change. And the COVID-19, you know, I mean, I mentioned briefly the kind of top-down imperatives, and sorry, just being called. So, you know, so there's increased governmentality and governance of many, many aspects of our lives. And so that was important at the time. But there was issues with that, inherent racism and sexism. I mean, I could go on and on. My friend in Melbourne, she was looking on the Department of, you know, Human Affairs or whatever it is in Melbourne website, trying to find some information about childcare in relation to the lockdown. And she said that there were more information about pets than about children and childcare. So it's like, you can go to a breeder's house, you can do this, you can do that with your dog, you could, you know, but there was no information. Can I take my child to their grandparents, or can I get a babysitter to come? It was very difficult to find that information out. So in terms of, yes, everything does change, but I think it's important that we agitate change too, that we don't just necessarily accept a systematic governmental change to things, that we need to have a more purposeful, reflective sense of change as well. So yes, everything will change, but it doesn't, it's not about romanticizing the past, because a lot of things change for the better. You know, we have better health outcomes and things, but, you know, just a more nuanced account of change rather than simply this idea of progress as linear. So.
Okay, thanks, Adele. And David Rowe has a question for us.
Thanks for that, and hi to all. I just had a question, I suppose, when you mentioned Queensland in particular, its role in sport in this crisis. I thought, I don't know if anybody saw a program on Channel 9 called The Sporting Bubble. Did anyone see that documentary?
Oh, I didn't see it, but we had a sporting bubble just up the road.
Well, Channel 9 did a documentary, and you can probably catch up on it through 9Play. And I'm not advertising, but I was asked to be in the program to talk about what was happening with Queensland and sport in the pandemic, and Queensland becoming a kind of mecca for elite sport during the pandemic. My role, I thought, was to critique that, but somehow that kind of got lost in the mix, which is not surprising when you're in television. But the whole idea there, and this is a program that was, I should say, sponsored by Queensland Tourism and Events, was that somehow elite sport was saved in the pandemic by can-do response on behalf of state governments and the leading male-dominated sports, although netball was in there too, but specifically league and AFL was given lots of prominence. And it just occurred to me there was a lot of criticism about that, about the fact that elite sport was getting a free ride. You know, it was kind of entrenching the existing hierarchy, exacerbating it. And they were getting a lot of privileges, not available to ordinary citizens, but specifically not available to sport at the community and grassroots level that, you know, you've been talking about in particular, Adele. So it just occurred to me that there was a bit of a tension there between people who were criticizing the speedy restoration of elite sport within Queensland and the barriers to organising at the grassroots level, which were still imposed on people who seemingly deemed to be less important in the sport world. I didn't know if you had any, either if you have any comment.
I mean, it wasn't fair, but I think that it is quite complex. It's not simply black or white that they shouldn't have been allowed, because for many people that rhythm and routine of the football season, you know, would have been one of the very few kind of anchors in their weeks, you know, that, you know, they knew that, and also the joy of winning. There is research around well-being and team loyalty and things like that. So, you know, in some ways I thought it was important, but then then you've got, you know, there was a lot of challenges. A lot of the young players were very challenged by being in that environment. I mean, there was issues with coaches, there were people breaking out of the bubble, and also just Queensland was really quite, I don't know how to say it, but, you know, very strict. In, you know, other people they might have had a fantastic reason to cross the border, and yet they weren't being allowed in. So there was that kind of tension there, I think. So I don't know, it was difficult to stop community sport, but it was one thing that they could do. And I do think that continuing on with those football seasons for some, you know, not that I don't personally follow a football team, but I know millions of people do. And I wouldn't be one to say that, you know, that's not a good thing. Yeah. Does anyone else, maybe someone else has thought about this too?
Well, maybe I could just put the question more directly then. Were the already privileged in sport privileged by the arrangements, the adjustments that were made, and the already not so privileged in sport were, in a sense, put in their place by not being accommodated to the same extent? Because that's my question. Yes.
There could have been ways to accommodate many various levels of sport safely, I think. Yeah, they just did what was simplest, or I don't know. But yes, I think so. I'm sure. I mean, that would be in future planning to think about how, you know, there are going to be pandemics, there are going to be other crises. It's not about, oh, we'll only have elite level sport, say with climate change, or we're going to have less time of the year where it's going to be cool enough to play, so therefore we'll only let elite people play. Well, that's not good enough.
Anne Lawless, I think, are you there, Anne? Yeah, oh, yes.
Hi everyone, how you going? Sorry, it's Anne here. I'm in West Australia and I live in Fremantle, and we had a sports hub here in West Australia too, Adele, and it was definitely a very privileged and elite experience to see that. West Australia sort of developed a mentality of Fortress WA, which is very easy because it has a very strong secessionist movement. So culturally that fitted in very quickly and very well. And what we also saw was the public reacting with horror whenever the blokes broke quarantine for their girlfriends, or girlfriends who snuck across the border in backs of trucks, and all sorts of naughty things happened, largely around sexuality and athletic activity. So, yeah, we certainly saw that phenomena here. And it just strikes me again and again, which is absolutely obvious, I know, but when we try to think through what this meant this year, the jurisdictions of the states and territories are such an important factor to take into account, and how very, very different that experience has been of COVID-19 around the country. But certainly here, there was, for me, looking at it as a sociologist, a very, very strong reinforcement of that sense that the elite will get what they want. And also because sport is so tied in with capital and money.
I think gambling as well is, was unfortunately probably a motivator too.
Okay, I can see Alan's got his hand up. So Alan, you ready? Alan? I think you're on mute again, Alan. Yes.
Yeah. Now I forgot.
All right, Alan, I might jump in. I'll just mute you and I'll jump in. I live in Cairns, Adele, and when COVID happened, obviously the first thing that happened is we were barred from going to our gyms, and so we spent a lot of time at going up and down the Esplanade and doing Tabata and so forth. I think things are slowly getting back to normal, and I think there's a sense in which people are still observing the social distancing. Not very many people in Cairns are wearing masks at the moment. I think the supermarkets gave up on masks and social distancing and cleaning your hands and all that sort of stuff pretty early on. But there seem to be a lot of people on the Esplanade and other places around Cairns doing exercise. It's certainly, it's dropped back by half, but we're allowed to go to gyms now in Cairns. Mm.
I remembered what I was going to say. I don't know if any of you remember it, but probably 30, 40 years ago, I forget how long, one of the radio station disc jockeys in Melbourne started the square football. He talked about that most people didn't like football or didn't want to have any interest in it. And he thought that was a big joke when he started. But by the end of the day, he had over 1,000 people wanting to join the club he was supposedly starting of the Square Football League. And he had to actually get badges made and sent out because he started all this. And there were thousands of people who wanted to join the non-football league. Any remember it? Or am I too old for that? Oh, yeah, you do, yeah.
I remember Keith Dunstan's anti-football league. Did people remember that? There's a journalist, crusty old journalist, Keith Dunstan, who years ago called this thing called the anti-football league. And it was quite an effective rhetorical device, because plenty of people came out.
This one was called the Square Football.
Yeah, this is going back many decades now.
Yeah,
I think back into the 70s, actually, before I was.
Could be the 60s even.
Yeah, and I think there is that kind. I mean, I've talked about this quite a lot because there's plenty of research on it, and the Australian Cultural Fields research that we did found what pretty much everyone else finds, which is that only a minority of the Australian population is physically active on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Only a bare majority actually goes to watch sport in a stadium or some kind of enclosed venue, but about 90% watch it on TV at some point. So, but the fact is that most people in Australia, oh, sorry, this was of adults, I should say. I don't include children because sometimes they're kind of made to do it, or more or less at school. So I always run this point that people who actually really like sport, represent themselves as the Australian population, are a minority, a noisy minority that claims the rhetorical space of us all, but is a minority nonetheless. A big one and a noisy one, but a minority.
Yeah, I have little or no interest in sport, but I grew up in Britain, and my school time was during World War II, when there was no sport. The schools' fields had all been dug up to stop gliders landing. They were just great trenches across them every so many yards. And sport went off the timetable. And so I had no input telling me that this is what I should do, or that sport is the best one, and so on. That all, I mean, by the time World War II was over, I had started work. I started work at 14. But still, it didn't give me any desire or access to be associated with sports. Now, how many people have that sort of background, I don't know, but that's my background.
Thanks, Alan. I might start to close this off. So Adele or Suzanne, do you have any last words that you would like to convey?
No, I think we covered it all, and yeah, just thinking, yeah, World War II, COVID crisis, current climate crisis that isn't feeling acute, but it will be, and sport as a major part of society has its role in that, and yeah, we just need to remain critical and hopefully grab the opportunities that there are, and hope for the best.
Okay. So on behalf of TASA, I'd like to thank you all, and certainly thank Adele and Suzanne for presenting today. And I think I'll close it off there, and I hope you all have a great festive season, and we hope to return in 2021. So thanks very much.